Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Forensic Linguistics. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law since the expert consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Patrick will discuss definition of forensic linguistics, what it can do, linguistics as pattern evidence, 2 case studies, accuracy and admissibility, summaries, and questions. To give you a little background about our presenter, Dr. Patrick Juola is a professor of computer science at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, PA. Dr. Juola received his Ph.D. in computer science in 1995 by the University of Colorado. Dr. Juola is a co-founder of Test Analysis firm specializing in forensic analysis of electronic documents. He has also testified in international court cases on matters of authorship and is a prolific author and researcher with more than 200 scholarly articles. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is linguistics. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this password into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Patrick, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. My name is Patrick Juola. I am the principal and co-founder of Juola and Associates. As she mentioned, we do text analysis, and specifically what we do is we do text analysis involving forensic linguistics. And I just want to explain to you what forensic linguistics is, because it's a kind of scientific evidence that can be very, very important, and yet a lot of people aren't familiar with it. First, a little bit about me. You already got most of this. I teach at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. More importantly, I am a practicing expert. I've testified in federal, state courts, and federal and state courts in the United States, in international BIT arbitration, and also in the courts of England and Wales. And fortunately, the nice thing about good science is that good science is generally good science anywhere in the world. So I am not a lawyer, and if you have any legal questions about this, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to tell you very much. But hopefully, if you have any technical questions or linguistic questions, I can address them here, and maybe you can find that there's something here that will help influence how you handle a case of your own. So what we're going to cover is we're going to cover what forensic linguistics is, and then give a couple of examples of real disputes that have been resolved with the help of forensic linguistics, and then I will take questions from you. We're going to be taking questions at the end, but you can submit questions, I believe, at any time, so you can just type them in right now and then we'll get to them. There will be a brief break for questions in the middle of the talk, and then we'll do some more questions at the end. Okay, so let me start out with a real ransom note from a real case. This was a case of kidnapping. A little girl was kidnapped, and of course the parents were frantic, and of course the police were equally frantic, because kidnapping is a very bad crime. And this is the text of what was received as the ransom note. I'm not going to read it aloud to you. There's not really any surprises in it. It says that they want money, and they tell you where to put it, and don't bring the police. Well, let me back up then and say what forensic linguistics is. The American Academy for Forensic Sciences defines forensic science as a science used for purpose of the law. There's nothing magical that turns chemistry into forensic chemistry or anthropology into forensic anthropology. It's just the use that you make of it. Similarly, forensic linguistics is the scientific study of language when used for the purposes of the law, such as What can one say about the language of that ransom note? Is there anything that we can say about that note that would be useful to the police? So let's look at it again. What do the colored words tell us about the author of this ransom note? Well, the first observation that I would like to make is the red words. The author of this note misspelled the word can and misspelled the word comps. But at the same time, the green words tell us that the author correctly spelled the word precious and the word diaper. Now, both of these are very difficult words. They've got kind of weird spellings that you don't often see. And I consider, in fact, the linguist who was consulting with the police to look at these notes considers this to be unusual. The writer is probably faking near illiteracy. He's faking bad spellings, and he's actually probably quite well educated. This is an example of what might be called linguistic profiling, where you read the note and you try to figure out something about the person who wrote it. Now, it may or may not be helpful to look at this note and say, well, the author is well educated, except maybe that tells you to concentrate a little more on some suspects and a little less on others. But there's something else really interesting in here, which is this phrase here, the devil strip. And I admit that I have no idea what the actual devil strip refers to. Before I had read this note, I'd never seen it, I'd never heard it, and I couldn't define it for you. And the reason for that is devil strip is not actually the kind of word that I use. Everyone in the world uses different words. One of the most common types of variations are what we know as regional dialects. So, what do you call the long sandwich that contains cold cuts, lettuce, and so on? Well, most of the country, as you can see from this map, if you look at it, it's covered in red dots, and what you call this sandwich is a sub. In fact, the national chain is called Subway, and they go and they buy subs. But you will also see, if you look, for example, near Boston or New England, that there are a lot of spots where it gets called a grinder. There are a lot of green spots, especially in the Philly area, where it gets called a hoagie. There's also a little cluster of green that you may or may not see, which is the Pittsburgh area, where it's also called a hoagie. And then there are lots and lots of other examples. It's called a po' boy in New Orleans. It's called a wedge in southeast New York. Sometimes it's called a torpedo sandwich. You get the idea. Well, I'm not the sort of person that would call it a torpedo sandwich, but I would call it a sub. And since right now I'm sitting in the middle of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the fact that I'm calling it a sub might suggest that I'm not from around the Pittsburgh area, which is true. I was born in Seattle, Washington, and raised in the Pacific Northwest. And so you can see that I come from the red area of the country. So looking at this note again, the devil's strip is actually a term used only near Akron, Ohio. And when I say near Akron, Ohio, I don't even mean the entire state of Ohio. It's not used, for example, in Cleveland. So the conclusion that the analyst, whose name was Roger Shoy, used was the author of this note is probably from the Akron area. Who of your suspects has connections in Akron? And when the police used that tip and started investigating for Akron connections, they were able to focus on one person and able to figure out eventually that they were involved in the kidnapping, and everything turned out for the best. That's a very nice example of what you can do by traditional linguistic analysis in a forensic context to figure out an important question, in this case, who wrote this note. So that's what forensic linguistics does. It applies linguistics to questions of interest to the law. So here are some example applications, and I could talk about these at length. What does a word mean? Suppose, for example, that you're dealing with a slang term. What exactly does this word mean? Who wrote a disputed document? This is an email. One person says that they didn't write it. One person says that no, it was written by this person. How can we figure that out? Or is a particular statement a true threat? The classic example of that comes from every mafia movie ever made, where somebody says something like, oh, this is a nice place you have here. It would be a shame if anything happens to it. Now, I'm going to listen to that and I'm going to interpret that as a threat, probably. But how do you argue to a judge and a jury that that's actually a threatening statement? This is the sort of question that a forensic linguist can try to answer. But for this talk, I'm just going to focus on the second task, who wrote a disputed document, because it's one of the clearer examples, and it happens to be the example where I do most of my work. So here's a real-world case. This was done by a person named Carol Chaski. There was a person found dead, and there was a suicide note typed on his computer in Microsoft Word. Now, ordinarily, when you have a suicide note and you have any doubt about its genuineness, you can do something like fingerprints or handwriting analysis, all of the usual questions. But if we're dealing with something typed on a computer, there is no handwriting to analyze. But there is something that can be analyzed, which is the language of this note. So the question is, did Alan actually write this note himself, or did his roommate murder him and then forge the note to cover up the murder? Now, remembering that what we said about regional dialects, if it turns out that the suicide note is written in the roommate's regional dialect, but not in Alan's regional dialect, maybe Alan is from the United States and his roommate is from Scotland, well, that would be grounds to dig a little bit deeper. I'm not saying that that convicts his roommate, but I am saying that that's definitely something to look at. Another case, this is based on work by another professor named Malcolm Coulthard, is where Carl signed a confession but claims that the cops edited his confession after he signed. Now, again, I'm assuming that all of these documents are electronic, or at least typed, and we're talking about the composition of the document, not the actual printing of the document. And the question is, did Carl write the incriminating bit? In this particular case, the incriminating bit, Coulthard was able to show quite convincingly that the writing of the section where Carl admitted to committing the crime was completely different than the style of the rest of the document where he was describing his activities on the evening in question. So by looking for the stylistic discontinuity, he was able to invalidate part of the document. And the third case, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, could simply be a dispute over royalties. Donald wrote a series of books, and then after he died, it was continued by a woman named Eve. The middle book is disputed. It might have been written by Donald, it might have been written by Eve. Who gets the royalties? Who gets the authorial credit? And you can imagine what kind of a problem this would cause. So, how do we address these questions? That's what forensic linguistics is. In each case, we need to know who wrote a document. Physical evidence like handwriting is not likely to be helpful, but linguistic evidence, and here I'm talking about the composition of the language, might be key to resolving who wrote it. In this case, we're using linguistics as a sort of what is called pattern evidence. This is a broader category that includes things like fingerprints, ballistic marks, bite marks, footprints. And the assumption behind any of these is that the maker marks the made. That is to say, the gun leaves specific marks on the bullets. So if you fired a bullet out of a different gun, it would leave different marks. But if you fire a second bullet from the same gun, it would leave similar marks. The ridges of the fingers leave specific traces. Different fingers have different ridges. Or specific tooth patterns leave specific kinds of marks. Now, sometimes this assumption is true. Sometimes this assumption is not. This is an area that has seen a lot of critical study recently, and the President's Commission on Science and Technology has published a lengthy report recently, which is discussed in the references. For example, fingerprints are generally pretty good and pretty accurate. Bite marks less so. It is very difficult to infer anything about teeth by looking at bite marks. Language, as we'll see, is toward the top end of the scale because language is a pattern too. The use of language as a pattern to tell something about people goes all the way back to the Bible. From the second quote in the book of Judges, "Then said they unto him, Say Shibboleth, and he said Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right." This is fairly common. There are sounds in English that are not present in other languages. There are sounds in other languages that are not present in English. If you are trying to say a sound that's not part of your native language, you are likely to say it wrongly no matter how you try. And as a result, you will identify yourself as not a speaker of that other language. Well, this not only applies to speaking, but it applies to writing as well. For example, everyone makes specific stylistic choices. I personally say sub. I don't say po' boy. I don't say wedgie. I don't say hoagie. I was raised in sub areas. I also use too many semicolons when I write. I have a tendency to use a semicolon where a lot of other people would use periods, and a lot of other people would use commas, although my 5th grade English teacher would be absolutely appalled at the use of comma splices. Nevertheless, people do that. Some of these choices are regional. If anyone here is from the New York area, you might be used to hearing people stand on line. But in the West Coast, people don't stand on line, they stand in line. Some of these choices are generational. There's a whole generation that grew up with the word groovy being used in a serious way, and then since then there have been several generations that consider groovy to be at best a punchline. And some choices are gender marked. For example, women have a tendency to use more of what are called tag questions than men. A tag question is simply where you make a statement. The capital of Idaho is Boise. But then to soften that statement and to get a chance to build more consensus, you turn it into a question at the end with a little tag. The capital of Idaho is Boise, isn't it? Some of these choices, as I said, may tie to specific demographic variables. Other choices are simply individual. An example of that might be the difference between these two statements. If I said the paradigmatic and systematic utilization of sesquipedalian lexical items can be an informative element of individual and idiosyncratic patterns of linguistic variation, all I've really said is some people use big words. But I'm also saying something else about the kind of person that I am. And so this has been suggested more than 150 years ago that word length might be something that can be tied to individual authorship. Specifically, Professor De Morgan was talking about the authorship of some of the letters in the New Testament of the Bible. And he was wondering whether some authors might use longer words than others. And he suggested that some of these days spurious writings will be detected by this test. Now, from a technical perspective, this is a very easy test to run. You simply calculate the average word length, and then you can use ordinary statistics, and you can figure out how likely two words are to be from the same distribution based on how close their average word length is. If we have something where somebody is saying, the paradigmatic and systematic utilization, that's going to be notably different than some people use big words, where the biggest word in that is only 6 letters long. So we can do this. The issue is that this particular method doesn't work well. It works, but it's only so-so. It's kind of like classifying people by height. Almost everyone is average. The professor 2 slides ago, he was not average. He used really, really big words, which is why you can't understand him. And Peter Griffin 2 slides ago, well, those are particularly short words. More often, it's like classifying people by height. Everyone's 5'8", knowing that the suspect is 5'8", or thereabouts, doesn't actually exclude a lot of people. Word length also isn't stable. I write differently to friends than I do to scientific journals. And I write differently to my adult friends than I would to, for example, my 5-year-old nephew. So I can't really use word length alone as an indication of individual writing. It's not necessarily going to give me an answer often enough to be relied upon. So if word length won't work, what else will? Well, one thing that has been shown to work very well in a large number of cases are syntactic differences. To illustrate this, just look at this picture for a moment. It's an ordinary place setting, no surprises there. And I would like to ask each one of you, where is the dinner fork? It's not hard to find. The dinner fork is the larger fork. It is sitting there between the salad fork, the smaller fork, and the plate. But more importantly than what you actually pointed to as the dinner fork are the words that you used to describe the dinner fork. You could have said, for example, that the fork is to the left of the plate. You could have said that the fork was on the left of the plate. You could have said that the fork was at the left of the plate. You could have said that the fork was on the plate's left. You could have said that the fork was, as I did, between the salad fork and the plate. You could have said the fork is to the immediate left of the plate. There may be 200 people listening to this podcast at the moment, and there might be 200 different ways of expressing the location of that one fork in that one picture. Now, thinking about that difference, let's go back to the ransom note. And notice that it says, put the money in the green trash can on the double strip at corner 18th and Carson. I personally would not have said or written at corner 18th and Carson. I would probably have said on instead of at. Now this is the sort of minor change that nobody is likely even to notice, but it's the sort of thing that if I'm consistently the sort of person who uses on instead of at, we can pick this up in this case, apply it to the ransom note, and that's evidence that maybe I'm not the person who wrote the ransom note. So these kind of syntactic differences can be very, very useful. Now, importantly, a good feature, something that we want to look at, is common, stable, and informative. By common, I mean it's the sort of thing that we can expect to find often in even a very short document. The word rooster is not a very common word. It appears about one time in every 1,000,000 words. On the other hand, on appears even in a very short ransom note. We want it to be stable, which is to say we want it to show up relatively consistently regardless of what we are talking about. Again, rooster is a bad example because rooster will show up if I'm writing about farms or if I'm writing about Old MacDonald and his animals, but it's not going to show up if I'm writing about forensic linguistics or if I'm writing about computer networks or if I'm writing about the history of the papacy in the 1400s. And finally, it should be informative in that it should be something that there's a lot of different ways of expressing the same idea. We have a lot of different ways of expressing the location of that fork because we have a lot of different words we can use, but there aren't a lot of other words that we can use for rooster. So a good feature would be a word like on, because it is common, stable, and informative. This is an example of what linguists call function words, which are short, common, and they're called function words because they are light on meaning. Instead, they describe the function that one word has to another. An example of that is the word of, which is a classic function word. If I asked you to give a dictionary definition of the word of, you would probably have a certain degree of difficulty. In fact, if you have a dictionary definition of, I'd love to hear it, or even better, the people who write the Oxford English Dictionary would love to hear it because they've been looking for an actual definition, an actual meaning for of, for more than 100 years. But what we do know is that of describes the relationship between two nouns. Similarly, the. The doesn't really have a meaning. It just serves to kind of foreground one particular object among a whole bunch of other objects. So it serves the function of making one particular object more prominent in the discourse. But because these are short, common, and light in meaning, they are stable across texts. So we are likely to find function words all over the place. It is almost incredibly difficult to write in English without using the word the or of. And there are many different types, which allows us to use multivariate statistics. What this means is, okay, yes, you may be average in your use of the word the, but you may use the word that a lot, and you may use the word of relatively little. And yes, you may be average in your use of the word as, but you may use between relatively seldomly, whereas somebody else might also use the average, but might use between a lot. So there are a lot of different possibilities for how people can vary in their use of function words, which means that, like fingerprints, there's a lot of different possibilities for points of difference or points of similarity that lets us identify the author of a specific text. So here's an example of how this works. I told you I was going to talk about the case of the disputed middle book. Well, that's a real historical controversy. And it involves the Oz series. Almost everyone is familiar with the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was written by Frank Baum. What they may not be as familiar with is the fact that Frank Baum then went on to write several additional books in the Oz series. The Land of Oz, Tick-Tock of Oz, Ozma of Oz. I don't remember all of the titles. He wrote 14 books of Oz before he finally passed away, and made a tremendous amount of money for himself and for his publisher. And with his death, the publisher was presented with a dilemma because they didn't want to walk away from this proven moneymaker, the Oz series. So what they did was they hired a woman named Ruth Plumley Thompson and asked her to finish the last book of the Oz series. You can see here on the right side of the screen the same cover, except it's by Ruth Plumley Thompson. On the left side, it says by Frank Baum. That, in a nutshell, is the controversy. Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz, 13 more books. The 15th book was not done at his death. Ruth Plumley Thompson took over a fragmentary draft and unfinished notes to complete and publish, and it was published in 1921 with Baum's name on the cover. That's one story. The other story is that the Royal Book was almost entirely Thompson's work. The story about the unfinished notes and Baum's name were merely created by publisher to strengthen sales. because they thought that a book by Frank Baum would sell more than a book by a then relatively unknown named Thompson. So you can imagine lots of possible legal disputes here. Maybe Thompson is suing Baum's estate for royalties. Or maybe there is an issue about defamation, and they're trying to figure out whether or not it's Thompson's or Baum's fault. You can imagine all sorts of cases that are possible here. But the big question is, who wrote the Royal Book of Oz, the 15th book of the Oz series? So, a scientist named Jose Binongo did an analysis largely along the lines that I've been talking about. He collected the 50 most frequent words. Some of these candidates would be the, and, to, not, as. You get the idea. And then he did some magical statistics. Now, not wanting to teach a statistics course in this webinar, I'm not going to talk about the statistics in detail. I'm just going to say that what happened was he started out with 50 different variables, which means he's got a 50-dimensional space, and not even Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock can comfortably deal with the 50-dimensional space. What the statistics did was they did a dimensionality reduction, which sounds like it should involve dilithium crystals or something like that. But what it really does is it just takes 50-dimensional data and it reduces 50 dimensions down to 2 dimensions that can be easily plotted. And here's his plot. I took this from Baum's paper. This is a little unusual, but basically what this means is this is a plot where 2 samples of writing would be represented by 2 different dots. If those samples of writing are similar, those dots will be close. If those samples of writing are dissimilar, they will be distant. Now, what I mean by similar here is they use the word the about the same amount of time. They use the word of about the same. They use the word with about the same. So we have frequencies of each of these 50 words, and if you pick 2 dots that are very close together, there's a good example of 2 dots that are very close together right to the right of the little cross that represents the origin of this thing. You can see 2 dots that are very close just above the line, and you can see 2 dots that are even closer just below the line, the horizontal line. Those represent sections of books where the writing was almost identical in terms of those 50 words. Now, on the other hand, if you look at that little white circle at the very, very bottom on the left side, and that little black circle on the very, very top of the right side, you can see that they are very different, representing the fact that the words that one sample used a lot of, the other one used very few of, and vice versa. So that's basically what we're looking at here. We're looking at how similar 2 pieces of writing are in all of those 50 function words, all of those 50 features. For those of you who have ever dealt with fingerprint evidence, this is basically a summation of 50 salient features across all of the books by Frank Baum, all of the books by Thompson, and then a couple of others thrown in. So looking in more detail, the black dots are the works that we know are by Frank Baum. Those are the first 14 books of the Oz series. And you'll notice that the black dots all cluster very nicely to the right of the diagram. Frank Baum has a very well-developed writing style. It is very consistent, and it is very easily separated from the writings of Thompson. Ruth Thompson's writings are the little white circles, which again form a very nice cloud, but this time to the left of the diagram. So Ruth Plumley Thompson also has a very well-defined style from all of her samples from the 16th book on, and these samples are clearly separated from Baum's. Then we look at the little hearts. The little hearts are the Royal Book of Oz. Those are samples by the Royal Book of Oz, and you'll notice that they all fall on the left side of the graph, basically clustering, just like the rest of Thompson's work, into a great big cloud. So they are part of Thompson's cloud and not of Baum's cloud. From this, he argues that the writing style of this book is unlike Frank Baum's and like Ruth Plumley Thompson's. Or, phrased perhaps a little bit more naturally, it probably was written by Thompson, not by Baum. And this is the sort of diagram, this is the sort of science that he could take into a courtroom if somebody were suing somebody else over the royalties to the book, and testify that on a scientific basis, he thinks that Baum is probably not the author, and that the royalties should therefore be given to Thompson. So this is a good spot to stop and take some questions about how this whole process works, about the problem of forensic linguistics generally and how it all fits in. So I invite anyone to submit any questions that we have, and we can push on for a few minutes.
Thank you, Patrick. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is linguistics, and any questions that you have for Patrick. My first question, so the spelling is so bad that they are obviously faking it rather than commonly misspelled words?
Well, that's something that that is hard to tell. But when we're talking about a word like cop, that's not a commonly misspelled word. Cop is one of those words that could be spelled by any third or fourth grader. So in this particular case, the spelling is so bad that they are obviously faking it. If somebody misspells diaper, I wouldn't be that worried about it. But when somebody misspells can, or somebody misspells cop, that's problematic. If you look back, daughter here is misspelled. I'm not sure whether that's a real misspelling or not, because daughter is a commonly misspelled word. I think that anyone who could spell diaper or precious could probably also spell daughter, but I'm not sure about that. But I do know that anyone who can spell diaper and precious can spell cop. And that's basically what I'm saying.
Next question. How does the fact that the authors have editors change the equation?
It depends on how much of a change the authors make. Very few editors actually go through and systematically turn all of the that's to whiches, or turn all of the ofs to ins. Editors are busy people and don't typically have that kind of time. But yes, if you have an author who requires really, really heavy copy editing, that can become a problem. In this case, if the author had been changing the writings of both of both Baum and of Thompson, we would have expected to see much better similarity between the two, reflecting a heavy-handed editor, because it would have been Thompson plus the editor, and we would have seen Baum plus the editor. The fact that we were able to get 100% division on the known texts, on the text that we know who the authors was, suggests that in this particular case, editorship was not a problem.
Next question. Can you comment on the regional variations in the John Benet Ramsey letter?
I'm not familiar with the details of John Benet Ramsey letter. I don't know the text of the letter, so I can't really comment.
Next question. Can you reverse engineer with forensic linguistics? In other words, can I, in theory, fake anyone's style of language?
That is a big open research question. It turns out to be very, very hard to do, because the features that are the most useful are among the hardest to fake. There's a very good paper that was written by a researcher named Sadia Afraz that talks about the kind of things that were helpful in terms of these are the most useful features. But they involve changes like you have to use more instances of the letter I. We're not even talking about the word I, so can I in theory. We're talking about the letter I, so like the I in the middle of engineer. And that's very hard to do, to change the distribution of letters, but the distribution of letters turns out to be a very strong thing. So in theory you can do it, but in practice, no, it's proven to be something that's hard to do. Any other questions?
Hello?
Hello? Are you still there?
Hi. Yes. The question is, what is the accuracy of forensic linguistics?
Well, we'll actually get to that in a bit. I've got some slides on that. Can I put a pin on that one and answer it in about 5?
Sure, that's fine. Thanks, Patrick. You can continue with the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those questions, for those very good questions. So the next case study that I want to talk about was from 2013, and this was actually my own work. This was a book called The Cuckoo's Calling, which was published on April 30th. The author was named as Robert Galbraith, but that was an acknowledged pseudonym. Supposedly, according to the publisher, Robert Galbraith was an ex-Special Air Service military intelligence specialist who had to publish under a fake name for security reasons, kind of like John le Carre and all of his spy novels, I guess. But somebody posted on Twitter that Robert Galbraith was not actually an ex-SAS person, but was J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series. And some of the newspapers were interested. We've got this detective novel. Was the detective novel really written by the same person who wrote the Harry Potter series? And I got called in to address this. So what I got together with the help of the newspaper was I found 3 distractor authors who were contemporary female British crime novelists. So there's a total of 4 candidates. I think they were Ruth Rindell, P.D. James, and Val McDermid, plus Rowling herself, who had also written a previous novel for adults, which gave me a lot of data. Now, this raises the question, why was I using female British crime novelists? Well, the answer is because a lot of people had previously done work, and a lot of people had said, this probably sounds like a female voice, this probably sounds like a British voice, and well, it's obviously a crime novel, so you should look for people who have experience in crime novels for this. So this raises the question of, why didn't I use, for example, Shakespeare? And the answer to that is because we know Shakespeare is totally different than anyone. There's just so many these and thous in Shakespeare, and that's going to create an artificial dissimilarity that's not going to help. But by focusing on female British crime novelists, I made the test as hard but also as fair as I could. And then what I did was I analyzed using 4 different feature sets. Word lengths, which were okay but not great. Then I used character forgrams. Forgrams is just a pretentious name for 4 characters in a row. So this could be like the word that, or this could be the T-I-O-N at the end of attention, or this could be the N-S-I-D in the middle of the word inside, or it could even be the N space T-H that spans the words in the. So essentially I'm looking not only at words, but also at parts of words in order to find out if there's somebody who really likes, for example, words that end in ing. I also looked at word pairs of words to go together. So what kind of things are described as pretty? Or what kind of words get used in passive constructions. And then finally, I did a Binongo-style analysis where I used the 100 most common words. So this gave me 4 different feature sets, 4 different experiments, and 4 different bites at the cherry to figure out who is the most similar author to the author of the Cuckoo's column. And I set an elimination threshold of the top 2. So remember, I've got 4 candidate authors, and I figure that the correct author will be in the top 2. Not necessarily always in the top 1, because there's always a little bit of variation, but in the top 2. The closest author will be one of the top 2 in each case. Well, what about the possibility if we've got none of the above? If it's not a person who's in any of them, then the chances of being in the top 2 4 times in a row are about 1 in 16, which is about 6%. So we've got a pretty good chance of catching. The chance of having somebody pass all 4 tests of being in the top 2 is fairly low. Well, what I found is that Rowling was the only person who never failed a test. She was in the top 2 in terms of word lengths. Her word length was most similar to that of a Cuckoo's calling. She was the most similar in her use of character strings. She was in the top 2 in the use of word pairs. She was in the top 2 in terms of the most common words. Everyone else, there was one thing that they were just completely unlike. Somebody had completely different word lengths on average, wasn't her. So the only person who wasn't eliminated was Rowling. And in fact, when London Sunday Times broke the story on July 12th, 2013, Rowling acknowledged authorship on July 13th. As it happens, July 12th is my birthday. This is the best birthday present I have ever gotten in my life, because it proved to me that this technology is and can be highly accurate. And as the question just pointed out, accuracy is key. That's the big question. How accurate is this kind of analysis? DNA analysis is extremely accurate. People have accuracies of like 1 part in a billion. And by contrast, forensic odontology, which is the pretentious word for bite marks, is basically junk science. You might as well use a magic 8-ball. Now, the opinions of the practitioners don't mean much, because you'll find a forensic odontologist who will swear himself blue in the face that what he does is absolutely scientific and absolutely accurate. The question is, can we measure his accuracy and can we evaluate it objectively? Because getting this right is the key to admissibility. Now, here, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, and in particular, I'm not a lawyer in the United States, but I do have access to Google, and I have talked with lawyers when I've been testifying. Any evidence has to come from, quote, reliable principles and methods that have been, quote, reliably applied to the facts of the case. That's in the Federal Rules of Evidence. So specifically, scientific evidence must follow a scientific methodology, which eventually will lead to general acceptance, the Frye standard, via the literature. And for those of you who are not lawyers in the United States, we can also look at some cases in Canada. There are some cases in English and Welsh law. The idea is that good science is good science. If we have a principle and method that is reliable and we can apply it reliably, then it is likely to produce a strong conclusion that will be acceptable in court. Going back, that's one of the reasons that I talked over the Binongo case in such detail, to make sure that everyone could see what the principles and methods were, so you can understand whether or not they could be reliable, whether or not they've been reliably applied in any particular case. And accuracy can be established simply by empirical testing. This is standard practice among most computer science disciplines, and the Plagiarism Action Network has been doing such testing since 2012. You simply collect a standard set of test cases and associated ground truths while blinding the analyst to these ground truths. So here is a document that I have just given you. I know who wrote it, but I'm not going to tell you. You let the analyst use their favorite method, and you compare their analytic results to ground truths to evaluate methodological accuracy. So here are some results. These are some results from 2013, and it provided 30 problems in authorship, and these 30 problems are now publicly available. So if you have a new method that you'd like to see, you can download these problems and test it yourself. In 2013, 18 teams participated, and 2 teams actually were not even as accurate as a coin flip. They performed below the 50% baseline, and they were wrong more often than they were right. But 8 teams got 70% or better. 2 of the 18 teams got 80% or better, and if you got together and got a mixture of experts, which is to say you let the 18 teams vote on the answer, you got 86.7% correct. Now, 86.7% correct on, this is a document that was written by 1 or 2 people. These were relatively small documents because the larger the document, the easier it is to analyze. So if you had huge documents like novels, you'd be much more accurate. If you had tiny little documents like a word spray painted on a wall, there's probably not much you can do with it. In 2014, they compared the 2013 winner to 13 new participants, and the 2013 winner, so this was the best one from the year before, placed 12th out of 14. So even between 2013 and 2014, the state of the art has improved dramatically. This is what is supposed to happen in science. Good methods get better, poor methods get kicked. The PAN 2019 conference is continuing to run. It is running even as I speak, and methods are getting better. But if you want a number just to throw around, a good conservative number is that 80% accuracy is the kind of number that you can expect from any reasonable analysis under any reasonable condition. So let's just revisit the Daubert criteria. Have forensic linguists been tested? Yes, you've seen an example of the test in the Binongo case. You've also seen examples of the testing, very rigorous testing in the PAN series of conferences. Has forensic linguistics been peer-reviewed? Yes, absolutely. Everything that I've shown you has come from a peer-reviewed journal, and there are references at the end of this slide that we can talk about. Is there a known error rate? Yes. The known error rate is the opposite of the accuracy rates I just showed you on the previous slides. Is it standardized? Yes. There are lots of protocols that have been written up, and you can just follow them along, and there is a scientific consensus around this that it works. There is a community of scholars such as those running the PAN conference to talk in detail about this. So this is absolutely science under Daubert. So, summary. Why should you care? Analysis of documents is key to many legal disputes. Who wrote this email? But if we've got an electronic document, like an email, there's not a lot of physical evidence, and this issue will only become more widespread as the use of technology continues to expand. I can sit down at a computer keyboard, at a public computer in a library, I can write a Microsoft Word document, and nobody can tell where it came from beyond the fact maybe that it came from that particular computer in that particular library, unless they analyze the writing style and they show that it's got too many semicolons. The science of linguistics can address this problem by looking at the writing style, and forensic linguistics can provide the evidence needed to solve these cases, like who wrote this email. And here are some references. The one that's probably most interesting to you guys is the first one on the general forensic linguistics, which should be appearing at sometime very, very soon. It's a paper that I've written with Professor Ainsworth, and it's to appear in Washington University Law Review. But there's a lot of other stuff here, including some papers on forensic linguistics, some technical papers on authorship attribution, some papers on forensic science generally, discussing some of the issues, and finally I've got a whole bunch of papers on evaluation and the specific instances that I've discussed. Thank you very much for listening to my TED Talk, and if anyone has any further questions, I'd be delighted to hear them.
Thank you, Patrick. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is linguistics, and any questions that you have. Our first question, would this analysis hold up even if an author intentionally changes, modifies writing and regional style?
Well, regional style is something that is not specifically looked at very much. If an author can modify his style, then it would certainly throw a monkey wrench into the works of the analysis. But it's harder than you think to modify your writing style. So it may or may not hold up.
Next question. Do you look for anything different when you analyze social media language versus normal everyday language?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can look for in social media language that you can't look for in normal everyday language because people are more creative in the words that make up. So, for example, you could use the number 4 instead of the word for. Or you might say something like KTHX instead of OK, thanks. But at the same time, social media language, a lot of times it drops a lot of the function words that you would be looking at. So one of the things that helps is if you do a lot of analyses, the way that it worked in the Rowland case, so you're more likely to pick up any similarities and difference, and you can get consistency by looking at a lot of different features.
Next question. Do you write a computer program for your analysis for each case?
No. Fortunately, the National Science Foundation was generous enough to throw some money at me to write a general purpose computer program. This program is called the Java Graphical Authorship Attribution Program, JGAAP, and it's actually a freeware program that you can download and play with if you like. It is, however, a research tool, so it's a little bit hard to use, and we haven't really stripped it down completely to something that could be used by an ordinary teacher in her 5th grade class or something like that. But this JGAAP program is extremely well tested, extremely reliable, and extremely robust.
Next question. Are you able to... Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Are you able to apply linguistics on text messages and social media messages?
Absolutely. That is a huge area of research. As a matter of fact, the past 5 years or so of the PAN conference has been focusing mostly on text messages and social media messages because people are so interested in that.
Next question. Do companies, as opposed to individuals, have identifiable writing styles to reasonable scientific certainty?
I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me to look into that question before. It's something that I will have to look into. If you want to get in touch with me and discuss this in more detail, my email address is on the first slide.
Next question. Do your references contain a reference to the study on faking writing style?
They do not have that reference, but the author that you want to look for, the lab director who's responsible for that is Rachel Greenberg at Drexel University, or you can get in contact with me and I'll be happy to send you some references.
Next question. When you have printed pages, have you also used font, printer type, and paper type in your analysis?
No. There's a whole area of questioned documents that actually examines the physical documents themselves. And that starts to get more into traditional forensic science like chemistry analysis. I do not do that kind of analysis because I'm focusing just on the language that's used. So that would be something that if you needed an analysis of paper type, I could give you some references for people who can do that analysis, but I wouldn't be able to do it myself.
Next question. Can forensic linguistics be used on text and social media messages in family law cases concerning infidelity?
I don't see any reason why they couldn't. I've never worked with it. The big question is what are you looking for in the analysis? If you are trying to prove, for example, that somebody other than the owner of the account was using a particular Twitter account, that's the sort of thing that could be analyzed. I'm not sure that we can detect whether or not somebody is being unfaithful by reading his or her writing style. You know, it's not like cheating lovers use bigger words, as far as I know.
In the last question, do you know about the typewriter dispute in the Alger-Hiss case?
No, I'm not familiar with that. As I said, I don't deal very much with the physical aspects of mark evidence. Typewriters, of course, are another kind of pattern evidence where the physical typewriter makes a difference in how it strikes the paper and therefore leaves a different mark. But when you're dealing with language, a lowercase t is still a lowercase t.
Thank you, Patrick, for all the questions answered. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note you will be receiving your certificates via email in 24 to 48 hours. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Patrick Juola for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Patrick, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. Again, thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.